Franz Ferdinand has survived. Let me repeat that. Franz Ferdinand has survived. He's alive and well and walking around Vienna right now. All around the city, relief washes over the citizens. They didn't mean for things to get so crazy, and they are thankful that their Archduke and his wife, Sophie, are all right. Back in the safety of their motorcade, Sophie is angry. She wasn't directly harmed, but she couldn't believe how reckless everyone was. She tells the Archduke that he has to be more careful, because if something were to happen to him, the entire empire would crumble. But Franz Ferdinand isn't worried. He shakes off the incident. He knows that while it was serious, it will blow over. And he's not wrong. The Austrians try to make an example of the man who attacked them. He was immediately arrested and tried, but his sentence was light, especially considering how much damage he did. He was sentenced to 5 years in prison, but back in Sarajevo, people are upset about this outcome. They wanted justice for the Archduke and his wife. For many people across Europe, they saw the Archduke's surviving as weakness, and they believed that he should have been punished for his crimes against humanity. Throughout the rest of Europe, though, people breathed a sigh of relief. This included the Russians, who saw themselves as the protectors of Serbia. If anyone knew that the Austrians would try to retaliate against Serbia, it was them. They knew that their friends and allies would need their help, and that meant that they needed to prepare. However, since the Archduke survived, they felt that the Austrians wouldn't be as aggressive, and so they spent the next few years trying to improve their military. But despite these efforts, it wouldn't be enough. Soon, word started to spread that the Austrians were preparing for intervention in Serbia. They were tired of the constant unrest, and they wanted to put an end to it. But they needed the backing of Germany. Luckily for them, Kaiser Wilhelm II was just as frustrated with the Serbs as they were. But why? Well, that's where things start to get complicated. You see, Franz Ferdinand was shot in Sarajevo, which was located in Bosnia. And Bosnia was actually a part of Austro-Hungary. But it wasn't always like that. Before 1908, Bosnia was an autonomous principality. But when they tried to assert their independence, the Austrians stepped in and occupied the area. This caused massive outcry among the Serbian people. They wanted their brothers and sisters in Bosnia to be free, but they weren't willing to go to war over it. At the time, they simply weren't strong enough. But they hoped that one day they would be. Meanwhile, in Vienna, the Austrian leadership was split on how to deal with this issue. There were some voices telling them to crack down on the region and turn it into a puppet state, and others told them to allow the region to be independent again, as long as they allied with Austria-Hungary. But the Austrians were willing to go to war over this territory. They refused to allow Bosnia to leave the empire. And while this wasn't popular among the general population, the elites were very supportive of this decision. They wanted to show the rest of Europe that they weren't afraid of conflict. However, the Austrians weren't alone in their actions. Their neighbors, the Germans, were doing the exact same thing. Ever since Kaiser Wilhelm II came to power, he was looking to expand his empire. He wanted to become a world power, and he thought that he needed more land to do so. He was also eager to flex his military muscle. After all, he was known for his brash personality, which sometimes landed him in hot water. Now that the Austrians were taking a hard line on Bosnia, the Germans saw an opportunity to support their allies and grab some land of their own. Now, I don't want to ignore the elephant in the room. The Kaiser also had anti-Slavic sentiments, and he wanted to crush any chance of them forming a larger empire. Meanwhile, the Russians weren't willing to accept this outcome. They saw the Austrians and Germans encroaching on Serbian lands, and they were furious. They were tied to Serbia by a mix of geography and culture, and they couldn't allow them to be destroyed. They demanded that both nations back off, but the Kaiser and the Austrians refused. They had too much popular support to back down, and they didn't want to look weak. So the two sides prepared for intervention. The Kaiser was adamant that the Austrians could count on his support, but he had one condition. If they went to war, he expected them to win. That meant that the Austrians had to shape up and stop being a laughing stock. On paper, they weren't as powerful as the Russians, so they had to find a way to level the playing field. Fortunately, they had a secret weapon. While their military might have looked outdated, they had recently modernized. They adopted new tactics and equipment that turned them into a fighting force to be reckoned with, and soon it was time for action. The Austrians marched into Serbia and began laying siege to Belgrade. Their troops were making quick work of the Serbian forces, and it seemed like the Kaiser's conditions would be met. But suddenly, the French stepped in. They threatened to join the fray and fight alongside the Serbs, and that's when the British got involved. They demanded that the Austrians stand down. It was too much pressure for the Austrians to handle, even with the Germans backing them up. They agreed to peace talks, but they didn't come to an agreement, and soon the Austrians were marching once again. They were confident that they could take down the Serbs. But that's when the Russians intervened. They sent their best troops to aid the Serbs, and the tide of the war began to turn. The Austrians were shocked. They didn't expect the Russians to intervene, let alone send their best troops. It looked like they were going to lose the war unless someone stepped in. Luckily for them, the Germans honored their commitment and joined the conflict. They helped the Austrians fight off the Russians and turn the tables. Soon, the Russians were on the run. It looked like the Austrians were going to win the war, but the Germans didn't stick around long enough to see it. They only committed to sending 10 divisions, and once that number was reached, they pulled out. The Austrians were left to clean up the mess, and boy, was it a disaster. The Russians were able to regroup and launch another offensive, and the Austrians weren't prepared. This time, they weren't able to hold off the Russians, and they soon began losing ground. To make things worse, the Italians decided to join the conflict on the side of the Allies. The Austrians were devastated. It looked like they were going to lose the war, and they desperately needed more help. At first, they reached out to the Ottoman Empire, hoping that they could join the Central Powers. However, they declined and instead aligned with the Allies. This meant that the Austrians were completely alone. They couldn't keep up with the Allies, and soon they asked for peace negotiations. It was humiliating for the Kaiser and the Austrians, but they had no choice. Now, you're probably wondering what happened to Serbia. Well, in this timeline, they won the war. The Russians annexed Bosnia and Herzegovina, while Serbia took over Montenegro and parts of Romania. It was quite the victory for Serbia, but they knew that it came at a cost. Many people lost their lives during the war, and it would take a long time before their country recovered. If you enjoyed this video, stay tuned for more historical tales, including more stories from the legendary World War I series. Thanks for watching.